I think that does speak to what a design project might aspire to be, is how can the road be more than a place for cars? How can it be a place for people to get through different modes and have different types of experiences there? And that's not necessarily something that looks a particular way. That's something that I think will come through, all of these methods that we've talked about or worked with in our own practices. But there is a kind of planning layer to it that inevitably needs to be happening and done really well to create the connections and the opportunities for moving through this space through different modes, not just cars.
Well, on behalf of the BSA Foundation, welcome you all to the BSA space. This is the last of the 4-part discussion series called Fulfilling the Promise, Community Building, and the Emerald Necklace. My name is Kieffer Varanasi. I'm a principal and director of urban design at CBT. I'm really pleased to introduce Matt Kieffer, who is the moderator for tonight. Most of you, or at least some of you, know Matt very well. He's the director at Ulston Stores and co-founder of Emerald Network Initiative of Livable Streets. Real estate development and land use law are at the core of his practice. He has a particular focus on advancing complex urban projects, including market-oriented and affordable housing projects, commercial and mixed-use developments, and facilitates and master plans for healthcare, educational, cultural, and nonprofit institutions, pretty much everything in the city of Boston, basically. Without Matt, nothing would happen. He's also a teacher. He taught urban planning programs at the GSD at Harvard and MIT, and has spoken extensively on real estate and land use and law policy. So please welcome Matt to take over and introduce our panelists tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kieffer. I'm delighted to be here tonight and delighted to be able to introduce our distinguished panel in a minute. I want to introduce them, talk a little bit about the format. Why don't you come up? And give you a little bit of a visual orientation to what we're going to be talking about today on Columbia Road. So let's start with the introductions. To my left is Andrew Howard, who's a city planner, internationally respected for people-focused design, and this is key, rapid implementation strategies. We'll be hearing a little bit about that in a minute. Around the world. He's really been active around the world. He co-founded a Better Block project, and then with a friend, and 1 year later formed Team Better Block. I suppose I should hold this closer. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, we're good? Great, thank you. Formed Team Better Block, which has brought grassroots revitalization projects to over 150 communities in 4 nations. His goal really is to equip new leaders to take action in their communities. I also know Andrew from the Loeb Fellowship. He was, like me, an active Loeb Fellowship alum, although you missed the meeting on Saturday, Andrew. He had other things to do in Haverhill. Next, Mark Klopfer, AIA ASLA, is a partner in Klopfer Martin Design Group and professor of architecture at Wentworth. You started Klopfer Martin in 2006, a landscape and architecture design firm that works at a number of scales, from urban centers in Malaysia and Abu Dhabi to outdoor classrooms for elementary schools in Boston. Before joining Wentworth's faculty, he taught in the landscape architecture departments at the Harvard GSD, at Cornell, and at RISD. And it has a BArch from Cornell and an MLA from the University of Virginia, and also has been an advisor to the Emerald Network as we helped shape that initiative. And then Marie Law Adams, AIA, is a co-founding partner of Landing Studio, an architecture, design, and research practice whose work negotiates the intersection of large-scale global infrastructure with urban environments. Since 2005, Landing Studios developed projects with infrastructure agencies. They partner with public agencies in Boston and New York, with public access landscapes, light installations, festivals, and exhibitions, designed very broadly conceived. Their works received such honors as the AA Honor Award in Regional and Urban Policy, has been exhibited at institutions including RISD, Parsons, City College of New York, and other places. Marie's a lecturer in urban design in the Urban Studies Department at MIT. So delighted to have our distinguished panelists today. I want to say just a bit about the format, and then I want to show you a couple of slides just to orient you to what we're going to be talking about today. The format, rather than having each panelist speak, I've asked them each to contribute some slides that illustrate work they've been involved in that they think is relevant to what we're talking about here today. And I'm just going to ask them a series of questions and give each of them a chance to respond, and hopefully we'll get a little interaction going among the panelists. They know a little bit about the questions I'm going to ask them, but they don't know all the questions I'm going to ask them. I'm going to surprise you. The idea is that this is not an opportunity for sort of rehearsed presentations. We're talking about things that they're all very directly involved in and familiar with and conversant with, and we want to get a bit of a conversation going. And I want to also be clear that we're going to be reserving plenty of time for audience questions at the end. So, Aaliyah is doing the slides, is that right? Where is she? There you are, thank you. So, part of the reason I'm interested in this subject is that I live next to a greenway. I was lucky enough 30 years ago to move into a house right next to the Southwest Corridor just as it was being finished, actually. And I've used that greenway pretty much every day of its life since the day it was finished. I've used it for all kinds of things. I commute on it. I walked my daughter to daycare, both of my daughters to daycare along it. It happens to have a transit line. I've taken that transit line since the day it opened. I bike along it to work every day. I use it all the time. A greenway is a great idea. Turns out it's not a new idea. It's an idea that's been around for a long time, and in some ways really was born right here in Boston with the Emerald Necklace, which many people call really America's first greenway. You'll see the plan at the top of the Emerald Necklace. In the 1880s, Frederick Law Olmsted, known to all of you, I'm sure, was commissioned by the Boston Parks Department to design this park. The original idea for the park had it going from, you can see from the Charles River Basin along the Muddy River to Jamaica Pond, Franklin Park, and the original section, or the original design, I should say, shown in the bottom, continued from there along the Strandway to Boston Harbor. So it was a complete necklace that went from water to water. The last part of that, Franklin Park to the harbor, was never built for reasons that are still a little mysterious. I'm not sure I really know why that never got built. It was part of the plan, but just never got done. So that's what we're talking about today. Here's how the park system looks today. And Aaliyah, you can go to the next slide. It's a very different city today than in the 1880s when Frederick Law Olmsted was thinking about this. This gives you a sort of a snapshot of the demographics of the neighborhoods that this 2.3 miles goes through today. And you see the average household size is larger than the rest of the city of Boston. Population density a little bit higher. More rental housing, more people of color, although it's not on the slide, an area not terribly well served by transit. And in fact, in a way, it's almost inaccurate to say neighborhood because it's a series of neighborhoods that this 2.3 miles goes through. It's one of the things we want to talk about today in thinking about how to do this. And certainly, these demographics illustrate what we all know, that the way people use public space is very different today than it was in the 1880s. So with that, I know we're going to have some slides sort of scrolling that give you a sense of this 2.3 miles and various points along the way. For those of you who don't know it, many of you were at the earlier session, so you may have seen some of these slides, but we thought it would be helpful for background. So with that, we're going to begin. As you know, this panel is about implementation. As the saying goes, to plan is human, to implement divine. So that's what we're going to explore here today. I want to start, just so you get to know our panelists a little bit, by asking each of them to tell us about a project they've been involved in that helps sort of frame the way they think about this 2.3 miles. Why don't we start with you, Marie?
Okay, sounds good. I think the project I wanted to talk about that has some parallels is, can you hear me okay? It's going under construction right now in Boston, between South End and South Boston. It's space under the I93 Viaduct. We began working with the DOT and a community advisory group on that in 2013. And it's about a half-mile long segment that goes, it terminates at the north end with an interchange with I-90. And so over the course of that half-mile segment, the viaduct itself changes in its architecture quite dramatically. There's also different kind of conditions around it. It's around the termination of Fort Point Channel. There's different groups of people that live around it. The north end is closer to Chinatown, and then the southern portion is between the South End and South Boston. It's never really been part of a particular neighborhood in the city. If you kind of look at those graphics that kind of chart where people kind of identify the boundaries between neighborhoods, it's sort of in a void between the South End and South Boston. And we began working on that project to think about what the type of public realm improvements could be there. MassDOT was starting to do an initiative where they were bringing parking into the area. And in terms of an implementation question there, something that became kind of interesting when we were beginning to work with the Community Advisory Committee was to think about how do you test the space, like how do you actually begin to intervene in the landscape as part of a planning process. And so some of the images that maybe you'll see later running through here are a series of light projections that we installed over the course of 2 years as a way of not only kind of reframing the space in terms of casting light on it and sort of seeing the viaduct architecture itself in a different way as some kind of infrastructural monument, perhaps, but also as a way of kind of speaking back to people who were passing through the space every day. And in the process, we were meeting every month on a fairly regular basis with the group of people, 12 individuals who were representing community groups, and soliciting feedback on what they saw, how the light was working in a very technical way, just as a way of sort of beta testing a project, because there was an idea that lighting was something that would need to happen in that space for it to become more inhabitable, to feel more secure in the first place. So it kind of worked on a very pragmatic dimension, but then also as a way to start to say, like, how do you re-envision a place? Because it's starting to speak to events. We cast, hearts on it for Valentine's Day and some really simple things like that. So it starts to kind of get embedded in the everyday life of the city that's going on around it for a piece of infrastructure that's fairly austere otherwise and sort of not responsive to the local scale. So we got some very interesting feedback which started to inform the kind of ultimate project. And I don't really think that that's necessarily the kind of ultimate aim or outcome of doing something like that, but that it starts to kind of at least start a conversation about how can this space be re-seen in a different way? How can it become part of the everyday life of a neighborhood?
Good, thanks. Marie, I'm going to go to Andrew next. I think your slides are up next, and then we'll see some of the slides of the work you talked about. And I didn't say this, but you each work at sort of different scales. In a way, you're really working at a very large scale, often with kind of repurposing infrastructure. Andrew's maybe at the other end of the scale. You want to tell us a little bit about some of the things you've been involved in?
Yeah, sure. I actually started out at the big regional scale having transportation plans. And has anyone like this shown up at your meetings? This guy's like, Carmageddon! It's all going to be crazy. Nothing works. And I think about after my 200th meeting with this, we started thinking that there's got to be a different way to engage with folks. One that we're not so theoretical, but where we actually get people involved really right at the level that they understand in a neighborhood, which is at the block level. And so for the last 7 years, we've been really focusing our work at the micro level, going down to 200 to 400 feet in a neighborhood. This is Akron, Ohio. Really kind of a typical project space for us, where it used to be a really great main street. Street's kind of been overtaken by the automobile in some case. We walk the neighborhood with the community and ask them what's missing, and then we create a sort of concept plan with them that mixes transportation and public space and private interventions as well, as far as like pop-up shops. So try to really like take on these complex urban issues on a small scale, but we incorporate all different layers of what makes up a good city. And always going back to what do the people right there immediately want to have happen? Who wants to start that pop-up shop? And then we don't stop with just the painting. We actually go out and do it temporarily. So we involve the community in getting out and actually temporarily installing pieces of the infrastructure, the pop-up shops, the programming, everything that makes the city alive. And so that green paint you see there is finger paint. So we actually get people out there like painting these spaces, and those trees are movable. But our idea was to get the energy going so people understood what they were talking about. And what I've seen progressing in the movement of temporariness is it's becoming more and more of a part of the everyday planning and design process in cities. This is in New York City right now, where they're using street furniture that it's kind of like Legos, almost. Like you can go out and repurpose a street, redesign a street without a big stack of design plans. You can do it with Legos like this. And so these are little pieces of rubber that they've used. So I think kind of our lesson's been maybe stop some of the planning, start some of the doing right now. And actually, during the doing, we do a lot of planning of itself. But once we found there's a lot of time that we use probably where we're talking about things where we could get out and experience places with people. And as professionals, we learn from that experience too. And then we get more people to take ownership of the process, and it moves a lot faster for us.
An unusual motto from a planner: stop planning. So interesting, very different scale, but like Marie's work, very much oriented toward engagement and interaction with users. Actually, I think, Marie, some of your slides are going to come up now. This gives you a little sense of what she was talking about a moment ago. We got these a little bit out of sequence with the lighting, yeah.
Yeah, those are actually being installed today, but this is sort of a more permanent scaffold structure that supports the type of lighting that we had spent the couple of years during planning testing. The lights at the top cast different ornamental patterns on the viaduct surface. What was interesting in terms of it being a different type of space to illuminate is that the kind of biggest surfaces you have are the roof above and then the sidewalk below. And then some of this is what's happening at the interchange, which is a completely different landscape. The focus there became more about stormwater and facilitating public access through. So we're daylighting all of the stormwater systems. So that becomes something that's kind of legible in the space. But some different kind of opportunities in a place like that, where the architecture is a lot more complicated.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to Mark. And Mark, is it fair to say you're sort of at the medium scale, maybe? I know you've worked at different scales. You'll accept that for purposes of this evening. So tell us a little bit about your work.
So we do a fair amount of what's termed streetscape work. I really don't like that term, and you'll see the images of it. We've most recently finished a project at Kendall Square, so this is about planning, perhaps. We usually are delivered a package after the city planner or the BTD in Boston, the transportation department has figured out what they're going to do, and then we need some sort of creativity within the lines of this curb and this curb, or this street face and this street face. So we do a fair amount of work in that regard and trying to tinker with something. The project that actually to talk about is this one. This is the steel yard that we finished a few years ago down in Providence, Rhode Island. It's not a streetscape. It was a brownfield site. It was a disused steel fabrication facility for construction, for steel construction of buildings. And two college students bought this and turned it into an art space. So you can go here and learn to weld. You can learn how to become a blacksmith. There are a lot of different ways that that space engages the community. And in fact, even though it's private property run by this nonprofit, it's become sort of the de facto park of this part of Providence, which is called Olneyville, that has almost no public open space. It's also along a river corridor, so there's interest in sort of making a connection to that. And that's work that we're continuing to do with the people who started the Steel Yard. And really, the Steel Yard became this kind of community center. How many people have been to the Steel Yard? Show of hands, people have been there? All right, so there's been some people. It's a great place to go visit. Particularly, they do an event for fundraising called Iron Pour that's very exciting. It involves molten metals, lots of flames and fire. It's quite a show, spectacular. But that's the way it operates as a sort of park for Providence. And a place to learn. Another thing that they do there is they train high school students in how to do metalwork and show them alternative careers, perhaps, that are related to the arts. So one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because it's very much focused as we were building this place. These are some of the products that have come out of that. This was a Steel Yard artist who did bus shelters with us in Providence. There's a way in which the place was about steel. And everything we did as a design move was based on steel. We have steel retaining walls in a lot of different ways, sheet piling, bundled recycled steel. But we were trying to mine as much as we could, like what is this place about? What gives it character? And in turn, we've created this place that's very much about Providence's history and has this great output that's being sort of moved throughout the city. That's very interesting, I think.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Mark. So you do see some similarities in all three of these, and particularly how sort of embedded they are in their local circumstances, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, as we've talked about, this is a very old idea. This has been around for 120, longer, at least 120 years, this idea. Is it still relevant today? In a completely different city? Let's start with you, Andrew. I know you may have a sort of a fresh perspective, not being a Boston native. Why is this worth doing in today's Boston?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is good to question it, and to go back and, my scale, getting down there and saying, is this what the neighborhood really wants too? Is this what is an immediate factor for what they need to be successful? I think there's, I think we introduced these kind of, interventions in the city. It's not all about the infrastructure either. There's also this, this cultural aspect to it as well. The kind of thing, if you build it, will they come? Will people use it? Is it one of the highest, needs right there? And so I think in asking that question, kind of one of the things that came to my mind was, well, how can we test that? Can we test, is this still relevant right now? Is this still something that is a priority? And what comes to mind is what they do in Cambridge when they close, is it Memorial Drive?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I kind of had that in my mind going. I was like, well, what if we close Columbia Drive for a couple weekends in the summer? And saw, would people really use that connection? Is that still relevant? Do people really still want to be between those two spaces?
It'd be a way to test that proposition.
Yeah.
Right. Mark, are we too wedded to this old idea? Are we too enamored of Olmsted, and so we're seduced into thinking this is still a good idea?
So maybe I'm the wrong person to ask that particular question to. So one of the things I'm really drawn to, I'm both an architect and a landscape architect. And one of the things I teach in the architecture program is site design. So I teach architects how to deal with the site and try to instill in them the idea of, like, don't treat your site as a flat table. So one of the things I find very interesting about what Olmsted was trying to do is that the Emerald Necklace, ultimately as a project, connected all these different landscape types that exist across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There's a drumlin, there's a kettle pond, there's an outwash plain, there's a beach, there's a river, there's the fens. That used to be an estuary. the Charles River there. So to me, there's this really interesting idea about a circuit that you could go through and experience all of these landscapes, even without leaving the city. And that's a theme that you can see throughout his work. And Marion Presley, I'm assuming, sort of talked about these ideas. One of the things that's difficult about the Emerald Necklace, and when people come to tour, when we have a convention, everyone wants to tour the Emerald Necklace and see it all. So do you pack them in a tour bus? Do you have them take a car? Or do they walk? And so they start walking from the common and making their way, and that is a very long walk, right? So now there's this way that everyone's starting to convert to using bicycles, and this is the perfect medium to explore the Emerald Necklace. And I think the way in which the original concept that Olmsted had of seeing all these landscapes on one journey, one trip, is now possible. And I think improving that piece to make that connection back to the water is a really interesting one in terms of having bicycles use it for that purpose, but also in ways that you mentioned, Matt, in your opening comments about how bicycles have become this new transportation mode, and it allows a connectivity that right now doesn't exist very safely, let's say.
Right. I mean, 2.3 miles, not a huge distance to cover, even on foot, but certainly by bike or any kind of non-motorized wheels, right? It's, I'm always struck by the fact that when you're in Franklin Park, at the edge of Franklin Park, you don't realize that you're 2.3 miles away from the harbor. You're actually closer if you went as the crow flies, but that there is a route that's only 2.3 miles long that gets you to the harbor. But I'm leading the witness here. So, Marie, thoughts about this, about why this might be a good idea today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, you know, to frame it as why is the Olmsted idea relevant? It's not a design, right? Like the idea of connecting these places in a different way is not a design. It's very open-ended. There's many different ways that this project could become manifest. And you know, you can look at different kind of linear park projects in Boston right now. The Rose Kennedy Greenway project is just an interesting one because I think a lot of us feel like it's really come to life in the last few years just because of the activities that are happening there and not necessarily because of any particular physical intervention, but it's just really interesting to see the different art installations that are happening there every summer and the food trucks and the kind of different fluctuations of people over time and user groups depending on time of day, weekend, and all of those things. So it's hard to say like what this would look like really because it could be so many different things. It could be almost an empty framework for other things to happen or for place for people to come together or do things. So I think it's kind of important to think about, you know, what is actually necessary to make the connection. There's sort of an infrastructural linkage that is necessary, but other than that, there's it's a really open question.
About what the actual design would be, yeah. So let's just focus on that for a minute. The concept, the idea is just to make that connection. Let's speculate. If Olmsted was alive today, as we know, he was many things, not just a park designer. He was fundamentally a social reformer who saw park design as it was the thing he spent the most time on, but it was a means to that end, and particularly at a time when the city was urbanizing and people didn't all have access to open space. If he were around today, would he still think this was a good idea?
So I think you would see it as a catalyst for change because that's how he saw everything starting in Central Park. Like he saw that as something that the city hadn't yet grown out there and felt that someday this will be very important. And it can have these sort of institutions to help people who don't have the means to go out to the Catskills, let's say, and see wilderness as it was back then in his time. So what that would mean to him, I think, is a question of speculation, but I still think it would be the catalyst because he saw the design of landscape and the effects of landscape on people as this sort of catalyst. You know?
Right. So a little bit to Marie's point too, he might design it a little differently, but he might still think the idea was a good one. So let's pivot a little bit to, I think you're all saying this is still a good idea. It's an idea that's been around for a long time, but it hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? What? And I don't mean historically, what are the circumstances? I mean, what are the challenges to trying to see if something could happen today that reinterprets this idea for the contemporary city? We know it's, urban infrastructure projects are never easy, but let's talk a little bit about what those challenges are and how we might overcome them. And Andrew, I'm going to come back to you. I'm not going to start with you. I don't mean to exclude you, but I know what I know what I want to talk to you about, which is particularly the tactical urbanism you do. But I want to start a little bit with some of the challenges, or actually, maybe I'll start with you. Why is it that tactical urbanism becomes necessary as a step along the road of doing projects? Is it because there are too many obstacles to getting them done, or is it because you actually have to improvise a little bit to figure out what you want to do?
Yeah. So you remember that first slide I showed you with the angry guy? I asked a couple years ago the director of the New York City DOT and the San Francisco DOT, and I said, y'all have got the money, you've got the know-how, you've got the materials. What is holding back you from doing these amazing projects? It's us. It's the general public. It's perception of change. It's the fear of change. So we hold ourselves back on these projects. And I can bet why there hasn't been a project done here is because there's not an advocate that is just screaming at the top of their lungs over there saying this is what needs to be happening. And there's not a community there that's just saying, where's our Green Street? Where's our connection? That fire has not been built up over there. I don't know that. I don't live here, but I can imagine that's what's happening. These other communities were yelling for it and asking for it. So we are our own worst enemies, I think, in these kind of projects. And so the tactical says, well, we have fears. We don't know how this is going to work. We're concerned about traffic. We're concerned about taking parking away. Let's go try it and see how bad it is. Will it be Carmageddon? Was that guy right?
So do you go back so you must, assess afterwards, after you do these sort of tactical interventions. How do you, there's got to be some mechanism for feedback that determines so that public officials who are making decisions about the next step have some way of knowing what worked and what didn't. How do you do that?
Yeah. A lot of times, first of all, we say is, let's consider this tactical demonstration at a public meeting. So we have them, advertise it as a public meeting. The officials actually attend it as a public meeting, and then we get survey material back too from that. So it's just like having an open forum of that.
It's before you do it.
Before you do it, yeah. You definitely advertise it as such, and you want that feedback. A lot of times, though, it's just been that now when you've done that, you've given the authority for people to become engaged in the city. And that's what I really look for, is I look for these people that come out of the woodwork that are like, all of a sudden like, oh, like I have a mechanism now to work with the city and be an advocate, and I don't always have to go to public meetings and ask for this, but there's another thread there to it. And then sometimes it's just kind of the anecdotal information that comes from it later, because once you started doing these, they're kind of like you're retraining the culture of how to use public space and bike lanes, and you're getting people reacquainted with this kind of lifestyle, and right now they only have a car-centric thing that they're using. And so we'll ask the business owners later, like, what's changed? And some of the most fun ones I've had is like a business owner said, on Monday, I saw this guy running in front of my shop. It's like, I've never seen anybody run in front of my shop, but it was just that they had a new perception of the place.
Right. So Marie, when you partner with public agencies, I assume, on a lot of your projects. So how do you overcome their resistance to doing something? This is very non-standard for a public agency to do, the kind of infraspace project that you showed.
Yeah.
What's the appeal to them of doing it?
Yeah. Interesting question. We've found that these types of projects really come down to individual people who advocate for something. So it does take someone to say, okay, I kind of can see this idea. And I guess our job as designers is to maybe create create a context for that to happen. Similar to some of these tactical projects, like how do you stimulate new ways of thinking about a space that is infrastructural, that is kind of single purpose right now? A street is not really a place you spend much time in necessarily, or you do in a particular way. So things like events or temporary occupations of places can begin to kind of be a new way of seeing a place, or having an experience, having a memory there becomes something that can kind of open up the conversation for a different way of looking at it. We've found that those types of temporary interventions are usually a necessary way of opening up a conversation about a place that just isn't seen as part of the public realm in the same way that a traditional park is. And it's a question of like practicing the space. If you don't know how to use it, if it kind of doesn't make sense, if the scale is different than you're used to, if a road doesn't feel like a place, how do you start to kind of create ways to think about it that way? It's hard to plan a place that isn't really a place yet, or you can't like draw a comparison, you don't have a framework for it. So I think working quickly and in place can kind of allow you to ask those questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how might you see those lessons applying to Columbia Road? There's a question for either one of you, Andrew or Marie. This idea of temporary interventions and just a certain amount of improvisation, how might you see that applying to Columbia Road, to getting something started there?
I mean, I think some of this can be pretty simple. Just, I mean, as you're saying, like just shut down the road for a little while. I mean, this Memorial Drive question is something that can just, test out the space and see what happens there. And it's not as straightforward as that, of course. We tend to work with arts organizations who will program it temporarily for something. So that there's some kind of event to come together around and kind of think about the space differently. There's a lot of examples of cities having like a shared dinner in a space like a street or something, and it becomes a way of doing something strange in a place where you wouldn't expect it to. Having a shared experience, it's a little bit weird, and it starts conversations. And I think something like that can be a way of kind of getting into this.
Mm. Mark, something to add there?
Sure. I think one of the probably biggest hurdles to face in really looking at the reality of what the street is the way streets are actually built. And the different city agencies that are involved, and the idea particularly about transportation of how it's funded and how the timeline is very much set up by that. All right, we have to spend X amount of dollars by July of the following year. We have to be so far along in construction. So there's a way in which more creative initiatives in especially road right-of-ways really need like interdisciplinary work before they become construction projects. And we worked on causeways up here as one of our projects. Mayor Menino had this initiative to do all the cross streets that crossed over the artery and remake what those are. And the first part of that study was done by the BRA as a vision exercise. What could this be? We won Causeway Street on the idea that it should be a street for celebration related to the garden. And it could be a street that's used that way, it's cut off at certain times, and you allow this temporary event to happen. Then we start to go at the project, okay, we have an idea where we're going with this, we have an idea how design can support that, and then we moved into where the Department of Public Works took it over as a project that was going to be implemented. And there we just kind of stopped, right? And transportation funding came available to do a bikeway rather than a space as an open space, or to do things that were art or facilitated festivities. And so the funding was directed in that way, and so now we have a street that's a very typical street with a bikeway in it. And that was built according to, it's still in construction, it's going to be done at the end of the summer. And there's a way in which the political will sort of faded, because these projects, to really implement them, take years. So for us, that was a project that we started in 2006. And as I said, we're just about to complete construction on it, which is 11 years after we'd started it. So one really has to have the long-term vision, and there's a lot of, just sort of very pragmatic implementation that needs to happen for how a roadway is still allowed to function, especially an important roadway like this would be.
And so how much of this is a funding issue and how much of this is a planning issue? I mean, part of what I hear you saying is, in a way, this straddles transportation and open space, and we tend to think about those two things very differently and fund them very differently. And if you're going for transportation funding, transportation planners are thinking about mostly about automobility and the kind of traditional way streets are used. Is it a planning and design issue or a funding issue, or maybe it's a little bit of both?
It's a little of both, and it's a culture issue.
Yeah.
It's like having different departments in the city that do different things, really collaborate. That is very, very important. And I think that's starting. It certainly is starting. We were doing a project in East Boston that's a collaboration between the Transportation Department. Charlotte Fleetwood was our project manager for that, and now Public Works is building it. And it's around a park, and so Parks is involved. And so we're starting to see ways in which they're starting to communicate.
So I'm going to ask a little bit of a leading question, and Andrew, I'm going to come back to you because this may be something you haven't tuned into quite as much. The Imagine Boston plan actually has Columbia Road in it, and BTD was doing a Green Link study, has been doing it. That concept of linking greenways has found its way into the Imagine Boston plan, and Columbia Road in particular. Do you see that as maybe the first step toward breaking down these silos between transportation planning and open space?
Yeah, that's another kind of interesting topic, because in some ways, all of these things are becoming closer to each other. And in the work that my office does in terms of repurposing industrial landscapes or infrastructural landscapes, they're never quote unquote park projects. They're always projects done through other means. So with the DOT, I think this maybe better answers the question you were asking earlier, Matt. How do you convince someone in a sort of Department of Transportation to build something that looks like a park? And that means as a designer, you need to think through what the park is, or what the public realm experience is, a little bit differently, and think about how things can double function, triple function for different people, different groups of people, including the people who maintain and operate those landscapes. So to speak specifically about this under highway viaduct project on I93, something that was always on our mind is, how can anything we do be built by a group of people that's trying to promote mobility in the city? So how do you create new connections? How can they become better than just getting from point A to point B? Can there be different speeds that you go through the landscape? How do you begin to think creatively about maintenance operations? Because this is a viaduct structure, there's a kind of regimen of getting man lifts into the space and doing inspections. And so that actually opened up a whole new opportunity for us to think about, well, if you need paved areas to bring these really heavy vehicles into the landscape, can that become a basketball court when you're not using it to maintain the viaduct structure? And so having some really long conversations with the bridge engineers and talking to the people who are, kind of understanding the sort of everyday operations of this kind of landscape gave us some new insights into how we could really creatively deploy things just like walkways and paved areas that would normally not be programmed. But there's always kind of different ways of looking at the time-based rhythms of a place to think about, well, how can the public kind of come in here and it can serve multiple benefits rather than just a single purpose.
Andrew, have your tactical interventions ever unlocked infrastructure funding for a long-term improvement? Is that sort of part of what you're trying to accomplish? Let's say it works. The bike lane, the temporary Legos are a sensation, and people start rattling the cages at City Hall saying, "Build us a." Has it ever led to unlocking permanent infrastructure funding?
Oh, sure. I mean, pictures say 1,000 words, right? So, instead of a rendering, you have a picture of people using it. You have constituents. Elected officials take notice of that because those are the voters out there that have already attended this thing and have an expectation of it. So, yeah, we kind of, blackmail ourselves into that a little bit, that we put it out there and then we say, all right, we don't know how we're going to fund this, but we know if we get the right people behind it, you know, this little mustard seed of an idea will grow into, you know, a great big tree. So we've gotten federal funding that way as well too, because I mean the feds have the same problem. You know, they want projects that are successful, and they all the time say that public resistance is one of the things that holds projects up. It's the one that delays projects. It creates extra meetings they have to go through. They have to go through comments. They want the local community to be on the same page when a project goes.
Sure. Let's come back to that, but I want to ask one more funding question before we come back to that. Open space is increasingly being funded privately. Philanthropy is funding open space, much more than I haven't seen examples, maybe they exist, of philanthropy funding transportation improvements. Pretty unusual. But funders will fund open space. And is that a way to unlock a new funding source by conceiving of this as, you know, it happens to be in a roadway, but it's really not just about mobility, or even fundamentally about mobility? Have you seen any of that, or have you ever, in any of the things you've done, have you looked for private funding that's motivated more by with open space or the use of public space or creating public amenities?
I mean, the one that comes to mind is Amazon in Seattle. You know, they just paid for a street to be redone with a cycle track on it. We've done a couple crowdfunding initiatives for bicycle and pedestrian as well. Partnered that with city projects. I think it's more of a good faith effort, really. And we've had some private developers also, you know, pony up. I'm not sure there's been a project yet that's been, you know, completely gifted and not returned. But I think it's, again, you know, the cultural side of all this stuff is that you want, and it's an opportunity, I think, for a neighborhood when they have an issue like this to come about to really focus in on what they want from the project.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let that be our last focus here, and then I know we want to open this up to questions. So, who are we doing this for exactly? And you know, each of you have mentioned both the importance of community engagement and how difficult it is to get things done with community resistance. We all know that. We all see that. It's actually, we would say it's a good thing that things that are resisted by local communities, you know, that they need to navigate that process and prove their worth. Particularly if they're using public funding, they need to justify that. So, is this, you know, we talked earlier about grassroots efforts, and that oftentimes the way this starts is some person or group of people is trying to make it happen. Is there, how could you see a way to that happening on Columbia Road? This becoming a grassroots effort, or at least the idea and the energy in this room merging with sort of local grassroots energy. If that was your objective, Mark, how would you start?
So this is the curveball question.
Maybe a slider.
I was letting you guys off too easy, and Gretchen's telling me that our time is almost up, so I had to.
Well, it's hard because I'm sitting here thinking about when have I seen, in all of the infrastructure work that we've done, when have I seen private money, foundation money go in to support that? That's tough. I come closest to when we worked in Pittsburgh. I think there was a lot of interest in people there, companies there, being interested in the riverfronts in particular. And I think it's because there are fewer opportunities to give money. Like here we have so many wonderful institutions, and I think a project like this competes with the MFA or the Boston Symphony or any number of things that really make trying to find money from private sources difficult. So that's a money question. A constituency question is a different one, and I'm also not sure exactly how one goes about that. again, I think the more that we could find spaces that actually allow both thoroughfare and space or an event to happen simultaneously, that's the key to it, I think. That there is some way that you start to see this as something more than a road or a right-of-way in some way. It's a narrow street with high traffic volumes, as a transportation engineer might describe it. So it's a very challenging question indeed.
Might it be, well, so, this is something that both of you, Marie and Dan, have been involved in. Could you see this as a sequence of local interventions rather than a 2.3 mile? I mean, is that how you might start?
Yeah, I think it almost has to be. I mean, it of course is a connective piece in the city, so it needs to be conceived of as something connective. But there are few projects that you see that, I mean, that it's hard to imagine a single hand really pulling this big piece in a city in Boston today together. It's clearly a place that ties together many things, and so the space should reflect that. I think there's a kind of approach, or at least, we like to think about it a lot as a designer, is just how do you set a stage for something to happen. It's not really about like our design voice so much, but how do you almost create a public realm infrastructure in a space like this so that you can have the event, so that you're thinking in a smart way about where traffic is rooted, so that you're not closing off the opportunities for many things to happen. And I think it's kind of a agenda in general for any infrastructural space that doesn't have necessarily a particular formal outcome, is that these connective pieces in the city need to do a lot for a lot of people. And so our job as planners and designers is to think about how can you embed the most possible for the most groups of people in it, which is obviously a kind of contested thing.
Right, thank you. So, questions from the audience. Gretchen, you have a microphone to pass around? How are we going to do this here? Oh, okay.
So I'm going to steal this one in the middle. That's important. I'll pull a battery.
Okay, this is working now. Well, thank you to the whole panel for being very thorough for this very exciting discussion. I have a more specific question about...
Can you tell us who you are?
Oh, okay, we're doing that. We haven't been doing that in the past events, Matt. Okay. Nidhi Gulati, I'm the program manager for the Emerald Network. Matt is the co-founder of the Emerald Network and my part-time boss, so everything is literally being recorded. So I'll do a good job with the question. So as we talked about the Columbia Road corridor and how it is really a connector of various different neighborhoods, all of the neighborhoods kind of need access to quality public space. Some are more ready than others. We know that, So if we think about it as a piecemeal approach, some to what, Andrew, you were talking about, if we think of this as piecemeal implementation, can you talk a little bit about how do you tie those pieces together eventually, both physically and socially, and also through governance? Like, how do you make that happen once those little things have started to sort of, on a map, look as if they're tied?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I can almost see like a micro project like that. Like I believe the city's already started where they've asked a number of communities to propose on public space interventions. Is that right? I can't remember the name of the project that the city of Boston just put out. What is it called? Public Space Invitationals. So something like that along the corridor. Get the community to tell you back, like, hey, this is where you start. Here's your win. Like, we're ready, we're organized, we would put this to use, a merchant would put it to use, something like that. And, find that 200 feet of that 2.3 miles to start with. And let that bleed out, into the rest of it. Have them be the proof of concept for the person that's down the street that's a little bit scared about the street narrowing or blocking a view with a tree or taking a parking space away. So, if you've ever looked at public education campaigns, I actually learned this when I was in Australia recently. Australia spent all this money on public education campaigns. They put posters and billboards up and all this stuff, and They spent millions of dollars on trying to educate people about certain urban issues. And they finally came back around to, well, people most of the time learn from their neighbor about an issue, and they understand things from it. So the more you can get the community to talk about the benefits of doing something like this, they're going to educate each other, and then that's your little seed that you can start with.
Hello. My name's Kevin Essington. I'm with the Trust for Public Land here in Boston. Happy to be working with a lot of folks on thinking about this. I'm interested in your perspective on the role of design in setting the stage for, I like to call it sort of a T-shaped community engagement exercise that's both broad and deep. There are 45,000 people within a 10-minute walk of Columbia Road. This will take 10-ish years. I've heard Tony Pangaro talk about the Southwest Corridor was the child of 1,000 meetings. So this is going to be a lot of conversations, and that this conversation about that you all just had at the end about private philanthropy as a catalyst, I think private philanthropy will be especially interested in getting the conversations going. I don't think there's enough private philanthropy in the world to do a $100 million-ish capital project. So as many of us in this room start to have these conversations about how we plan for the first couple years, can you tell us a little bit more about how good design, tactical urbanism can be a really core part of these early community engagement parts?
You want to start with that, Mark? I wonder if the Causeway Street example is a way to talk about the role of design in that community engagement process.
Well, I think that probably how we do design is changed. So actually, I think starting with a design-based department in the city sort of helping to facilitate that makes sense. So that was the one piece of the Causeway experience that makes sense. And I think that, what the sort of work that Andrew's doing also makes sense. Let's try some things before we actually commit to moving a curb to do something, right? I think that does make sense sort of institutionally. I'm not sure outside of that it's a great example because at the time in 2006, almost no one lived on Causeway Street, and that's changed a lot to how it is today. So I think that there's probably better models out there, or more recent models that would be suited better to the question, actually.
Dan, Reid, you have thoughts on this question of the role of design at that early stage in helping, shape community engagement?
Yeah, I guess I'll speak to a project that I think it's a very interesting project that's not from around here, but is the Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. It's an enormous. The airport was decommissioned in 2008, and the city did not have a clear plan for what they wanted to use with it, but they wanted to open it up to a public conversation. It's larger than Central Park. It's an enormous, new void space in the city. There's an affordable housing problem in the city. There's a lot of competing interests, and the kind of, it's not a kind of utopian project in any way, but for a few years, they decided to just open up the space to experimental uses, what they called pioneer uses, and they invited a competition for different community groups to submit proposals for community gardens, for temporary art installations, on all of those things, and interestingly, I think it was in 2014, the city had a referendum actually to keep those pioneer uses as a permanent use, as a long-term kind of way of using the airport space. And there was actually no physical intervention that had any type of foundations, no infrastructural work that was ever done on it. It's just a green, open, grassy field. But it is actually very heavily used by the entire city. People just come in and it's an amazing, and I think that's something that's of course really interesting to think about. In a dense kind of old city like this, you don't get very many opportunities to come together and rethink, like, well, what can this kind of new infrastructural piece be? So there is a model of actually preserving the open-endedness for experimentation.
Just one little tidbit. I just got an email today, actually, from my urban designer, hey, Hyerton, telling me all the things that in our last project we screwed up. Design-wise, we just missed. We're like, this was too far away from each other. There was a gap here that no one could see this piece, and luckily, we only spend a couple $1,000s on our projects, and we get to kind of, we have a good eraser that we get to go back and fix things later. So, I think that's going to be a big experience, especially on 2.3 miles. I mean, it's so easy to assume, oh, people are going to walk that far to get to this thing, or that there's, this street will function well at this speed, and we can have a cafe here. There's going to be a lot of assumptions, and as good as our models are, and it's still difficult. And I think what's different maybe today than from the Olmsted days is there was back then a pretty predictable rhythm that you could build a street in. And today, our humans are so finicky. Our ideas of design and what's cool is changing so fast. I mean, everyone knows that park in their neighborhood that was designed in the 80s, right? It looks like it was designed in the 80s. That's not acceptable anymore in design. We're being forced to create things that are timeless, but these trends are changing so fast that we're having to come up with new materials and new ways of interpreting the public space. So
Hard to be trendy and timeless at the same time?
It's hard.
Hi, I'm Martha Andrus. I'm an architect. And my question is about equity and how you can build equity into design. There are a lot of examples of places where the physical environment's been improved and it triggers gentrification, and the people who originally lived in the area are driven out one way or another. And I wondered if you, through your experience, have any ideas for how this project, which is in a particular demographic and income area, could actually promote jobs, promote the things that the community most needs and wants.
Anybody want to start with that? Andrew?
I'll give a shot because it's happening in my neighborhood, for one thing, in Dallas. And it takes time. I mean, it is still, it's not overnight that happens. It's so weird. We had a big investment in a streetcar, and when we first started talking about it, no one really believed it was going to happen. And I didn't see anything really start changing until the rails went in and the first ding of the bell went happen, and then you start seeing property switch over. It's weird how real estate somewhat lags, and I think it will probably do that in this. The opportunity is here. I think we have time to prepare a community for that, and there's new techniques for that as well. The biggest thing is getting people to own their property, I think, is number one, and there's getting to be more mechanism like that. I think Dorchester has a lot of programs that I've seen that they're helping to do that, and even get jobs more local as they go in. But I think a lot of times in the planning process it fails in that it doesn't start thinking about that stuff until after that first bell rings, and it's too late then. It's we have to start doing those kind of keeping people in place now. And I'll shake the hand if anyone's figured it out, but there are a lot of tools we can start throwing in, but you got to start yesterday, right, doing that. So I think even before you put the first pencil line down of what that street's going to be, you need to look at the cultural and social aspects of it first and prepare that. That plan should be as important as the infrastructure plan.
So the thing I would add is that I think it's important, I think we learned this in the 20th century, that architects are not the going to deliver the panacea. And I think understanding what our role is and understanding what our role isn't is important. And so if this goes forward as a project, understanding that having a forward visionary economist involved in that would help tremendously. I think building the right team is essential. That's what I've learned in my career. I don't profess to know everything. Sometimes designers do that. I think it's really important that we don't do that and find somebody who's the right person to sort of tackle an economic question, who really understands economics, and then start to see how that works within a team to dovetail into a design intervention. I think that's essential, because really, what do we know about economics other than our small world of how we build things?
Maria, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think these are very, this is the right points. The design project is only a small piece of it, and it can't happen in a vacuum. There's got to be policy measures in place to support a project like this. We're well aware of lessons learned from other places. So, I mean, I think this is all part of starting that. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I just have a question because I keep seeing the image on the screen of the emerald necklace, and the sort of notion of the sort of tactical and the implementation of something sort of over time, and the sort of networking and how it cuts through all these communities seems to imply or start to suggest a very, in a way, fragmented and nuanced type of landscape. And it, for me, then becomes an interesting question of scale, because I then keep watching the video on the screen, and there we're probably seeing the largest sort of collective forest in the city. We also keep seeing the image of what is the largest beach in the city. We have probably, it ties together the largest lawn. It's the largest boulevard in the city of Comm Ave, the largest lake probably, except maybe the one in Alston there. And so it starts to say, are these actually a series of like hyper nuanced, small implementations in a community? Or is the idea of a 2.3 mile long stretch something that actually becomes like, and this even gets to the question of equity and what community does it serve, is what does the city sort of need, maybe that at a certain scale that it doesn't have. When you think in 2.3 miles, like I have lots of little street intersections in the city where if I want to have a market or I want to eat outside, I hundreds, to pick from. But where do I have a 2.3 mile long stretch? Does that raise, is the tactical approach to get to sort of discovering that, or is it about discovering 100 little micro moments? How do you sort of translate the scale of implementation tactical studies to, let's say, identifying a bigger pursuit or potentially a more valuable outcome for the city?
Is it about the pieces or the whole?
That's a great question. I sort of think that Olmsted's original strategy is kind of interesting that way, because he saw the Fens as a thing, Kettle Pond as a thing, the Arnold Arboretum as a thing, Franklin Park as a thing, and then it's connected, right, with beautiful, what at the time were carriage roads. So now that we drive on them at 55 miles an hour, it's a different use than what they were designed for. And what is that now? It goes back to Matt's question of like, what's the Olmsted, what would he do now, right? How do you reinterpret the connective tissue between things that are spaces?
Could you say, in a sense, maybe that was a little bit of his genius, is that he didn't feel he had to make that choice? It's about both the whole and the parts. It's about linking the parts together into a larger whole, so it's both?
Yeah, and he also had some width to work with, so those actually are landscapes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Not just
it's a little more challenging
right
now
away.
For sure. Yeah.
Right. Other thoughts on that, Andrew?
Yeah, I don't see it as just a 2.3 mile tree lined street that's ubiquitous and looks very much the same. But it's kind of like how when you visit a city, you remember that little cafe, you remember that instance where you saw someone drinking from a fountain, or you remember these little pieces of it, and kind of the in between kind of gets a little bit blurry between it. So there's probably going to be a little blur between some of those pieces. But I think what the tactical can do, or those first pieces that you do, is it tells you where to start, on something like this. I don't think we have the same kind of, I wouldn't say blank slate that Olmsted had, but he had a blanker slate to work with. Now this is a retrofit situation, so it's going to have to be you, and then let's start tying those pieces together.
We have a question here.
Hi, I'm Ann McKinnon. I've been to these before. I still don't know what the project is. I don't know what the problem is that you're trying to solve or what the project is. All I hear is the project. So I think, to put a plug in for planning, we need to sort of step back and really identify what we're trying to do. Is this about transportation? Is this about green space? Is this about green? We can go paint the median green tomorrow. But I think the other thing is that this is a regional facility we're talking about. This is a traffic sewer that connects Route 28 to Marcy Boulevard and the Southeast Expressway. So going and closing it is probably not ever going to happen. So we need to think about what we're doing, talking with the people in this room, but we also need to think about the lots of people who use that facility on foot, bike, car, bus to get to these streets. I don't know if the panelists have been to Columbia Road during the peak hour, but it's a disaster. So I like the idea of small interventions that can be done quickly, because I think Kevin said this is a $100 million project. This is a $17 million project in the capital budget for the city, as identified in the Imagine Boston plan. I mean, that's not enough to do 2.3 miles of major work. So maybe again, I don't know what the project is. Maybe the intent is to do smaller things. So I think it would help the group and the people involved and the people who live there and the people who use the street to think, to identify what we're trying to do and then to break it down to short-term and long-term, which is what I thought Matt said at the beginning of the effort here tonight. Otherwise, I'm going to leave here again not knowing what we're trying to do and what the first step is.
So would the panelists all agree that planning would be a good next step? We've talked a little bit about, I'm going to reframe Ann's question a little bit, and Marie, in light of what you said earlier, it's less a design than a concept at this point. So, and I think some of the discussion kind of reflects that we're all having a little bit of trouble getting our arms around exactly what this is. Is it big or small? Is it for the neighborhood? Is it a regional resource? Is it a series of places? Is it one? Is it nature? Is it transportation? How would you start? To take Ann's question, we're not going to answer all those right here in the next 5 minutes, but how would you start answering those questions if this got some traction?
Yeah, I certainly don't know how to solve the traffic problems that you're talking about. That's a really big question, but I think that does speak to what a design project might aspire to be, is how can the road be more than a place for cars? How can it be a place for people to get through different modes and have different types of experiences there? And that's not necessarily something that looks a particular way. That's something that I think will come through, all of these methods that we've talked about or worked with in our own practices. But there is a kind of planning layer to it that inevitably needs to be happening and done really well to create the connections and the opportunities for moving through this space through different modes, not just cars. But beyond that, there's so many different ways that the project could become realized that I think it's something that really depends on who gets involved and when, where.
Yeah, and I'd like to say that. I mean, I didn't intend to say that the road should be closed forever. I think more of, as a start, you could do an intervention on a Sunday where you close it for half the day to see. No, that wouldn't work either.
Or you could close a part of it.
Close a
lane, take a lane, or.
We don't have a grid system here.
Let's see. Maybe a lane on Sunday then. Maybe that would work. But I think what I was trying to put in place is that maybe there is planning that needs to be done, but maybe it's not the traditional planning process of relying upon traffic models and expert advice and public meetings. That maybe there's something that needs to be more grassroots and something that is more experiential for this place than just fact.
Okay.
My name is Chris Iworks. I'm an architect. And this may be not so much a question, it's just an observation about things. And the discussion that you've been having seems to be between placemaking strategies, which may or may not have anything to do with connectivity. And that seems to be, in a way, the stronger thing that you have a purchase on and experience with, is some success at doing that in places. But the idea of creating an effective connection seems weaker. The emerald necklace seems to be what you're hanging this on as a pattern that connects all around the city. But I think it'd be useful to look at larger patterns of use in the city as a way of perhaps adding additional impetus for why you would do this. And so what I'm thinking of is you've got the Franklin Park Zoo there, which is the largest public institution we've got in the city, and it also only sees probably 150,000 people a year. In Boston, you have on the waterfront the Museum of Science, the New England Aquarium, Children's Museum, the ICA, and the Freedom Trail, which have millions of visitors. And they could all connect to each other by water, and they actually could connect to this bridge by water. And the one thing that the Franklin Park Zoo suffers from is their location, and it's hard to get to. So if you could kind of layer that into the reasons why this is a good idea, it might open up new avenues of both funding and interest and impetus to do something.
So Chris is kind of taking us back to Olmsted, right? About the connection, about connecting Franklin Park to the harbor with a very sort of contemporary twist. And he characterized that as an observation rather than a question. But does anyone have any reaction to that?
I was kind of thinking about your previous panelists that you had from Indianapolis, who he used the same kind of philosophy to go to the art institutions in Indianapolis and say, you've got this beautiful art inside of your museum or your gallery or your institution. Shouldn't the street be just as beautiful? And it's kind of that we've got a number of institutions along this way, and so maybe it's a reason to do this, but it's also a funding strategy for it too. Maybe it's not completely funded that way, but shouldn't your entrance to the zoo or to the university be as beautiful as what's inside?
I think that the question of the connectivity or the kind of infrastructural underlayer of what this project is, there's the idea of like, well, what can it be in terms of a place and how can it start to embody different neighborhoods and that sort of thing, which is what I would say is the hard question because, there's so many different voices and interests. The planning, the infrastructure, and the connectivity is almost the kind of easy, hard project within it. It takes a lot of time, and you have to look at everything and talk to everyone, and it's going to be tactical inevitably because this is a highly built environment. So there's a lot of existing conditions to take into account, but in a way, that I've been taking that for granted as part of this conversation, that getting the connectivity can happen. I mean, there is a space in the city, and to be able to kind of choreograph between biking and walking and whatever ends up being programmed into the space, we have those tools and we know how to do that. That's sort of the kind of technical underlayer, but the kind of fundamental challenge is doing it in a way that kind of serves as many groups of people and ecological functions as you can in that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll take a stab at this too.
Pardon? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So actually, I think that's an interesting question. Maybe I would even extend the question to say, I know Franklin Park has had issues just as a park. It was one of Olmsted's big 3 parks that he saw as important to his career and his life work. And it's the one that's kind of the most underwhelming. And maybe, in fact, there needs to be a question about, could there be something beyond a zoo that would actually change its fate, and the connection to that then become something? So that's an interesting question, that maybe the sort of destination of that piece needs to be reconsidered, both for the fate of this topic of this connection, as well as the park itself. So I think that might even be a bigger question, and maybe that actually gives something more for this project to grab onto to make it happen, perhaps.
So I want to press you on that a little bit. I take great offense at the suggestion that I mean Franklin Park's an amazing place. Wouldn't many people say it's 500 acres in the middle of the city? Many people don't know about it. Many Bostonians who live 2 or 3 miles away have never been there. It has everything from wilderness to active recreation, in addition to the zoo. It's got a golf course, play areas, ball fields, and so on. Does it need to be more than it is, or does it just need to be taken care of and become more accessible and more well-known?
Well, I think it's worth having that question debated. So I'm saying that in light of the other 2 spaces that are Central Park and Prospect Park, And, you know, those have seen incredible influx of money. They also have a different adjacent conditions. They have a different densities, perhaps. But I think it's a question worth exploring relative to this.
Interesting.
Because I agree with everything you said. It's a great park for what it is.
And
how do
wouldn't
we
you-
think about that?
And
now?
underappreciated, wouldn't you say? mean,
I would,
yeah.
absolutely. And that's part of its problem.
Yeah, yeah, great.
Hello, everybody. My name is Natalia. I actually work on the Imagine Boston 2030 plan. I'm the director of engagement. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of the city's perspective on both Columbia Road and Franklin Park, since it just came up. So as we've been, let me back up. So Imagine Boston 2030 is the first citywide planning process for the city of Boston in over 50 years. And Columbia Road is one of many pieces of the city that we're focusing on. The Go Boston 2030 is our transportation plan that came out last month, where they identified $17 million as the cost for a feasibility study to really redesign and enhance Columbia Road. I think the reason why this is coming up now, and it's very, very important, especially for Mayor Walsh, is really around equity and a connectivity issue. If you look at the demographics along the Fairmont corridor, they are the most underserved communities. There has been historical redlining and basically isolation, and a lot of those are reasons why Columbia Road has never been completely enhanced. Maybe Franklin Park hasn't had all the funding it's needed to have, and so at this point in time, it's an incredible opportunity for us to identify how we can really enhance it as a green transportation corridor. So communities around Franklin Park don't really have access, both transportation, public transportation, or walkable, pedestrian, bikeable access to the waterfront. So we're really looking at this as multi-pronged approach. How do we enhance Franklin Park? It is already a regional destination. How do we make it so that it can be self-sustainable? How can we make it so that it's beautiful for its neighbors, but also a destination for tourists and for the regional commuters that come through? How do we really enhance Columbia Road for the residents? How do we make sure it's a place-making opportunity for residents, that it's serving residents to what their necessity is, while also being a green transportation corridor? We all know, anyone who's ever driven through Columbia Road, it is a mess. It's very, very difficult to do that. But we also know that it can't be anything else at this point in time. So how do we really make it the best that it can be as we continue this planning process? I encourage all of you to read the document. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be releasing the second draft of Imagine Boston 2030, with the final coming out this summer. And what that will really do is go a little bit deeper into why all these pieces are important and how the city can really make them a reality. But I do want to emphasize that we have not started a community process for this. There has been a lot of community conversations and a lot of community engagement in the past years that have really informed the necessity for enhancing Columbia Road. And so as we move forward with those philanthropy dollars potentially helping us fund, whether it's a role or a study or consultants or whatever it might be, and then as we move forward getting those dollars and getting the planning more in place, then we can really start a community process that will help us really design Columbia Road to be what the community needs it to be and wants it to be, and how we can envision a much more connected city.
Right, thank you for that perspective. I wondered too whether you were going to mention, the question we got about equity and displacement, and I know the mayor's set up an Office of Housing Stabilization, and do you see that as a particular component of this community engagement effort once it starts?
Hello. Okay. So yes, since the mayor established the Office of Housing and Stability, that was established in result to the housing plan that came out in September of 2015, which identified that we are under tremendous pressure in the city of Boston in order to prevent and to ensure that we can welcome new Bostonians while still protecting and ensuring that current Bostonians can stay here. We need to build a lot of housing, and so the amount of units was 53,000, and that is just a small part of what we're doing as a city to prevent displacement. Equity is the #1 kind of leading factor in the Imagine Boston 2030 plan. It ties into almost everything that we do, really thinking about the city and all of its residents, whether it's, our most low income and poor populations to, our wealthy, our wealthy residents or people who are commuting in to work here. So it's really, we're trying to have a multi-pronged approach to ensuring that the community can thrive. And when we think about development, we're really thinking about mixed use and mixed income properties.
Thank you. Thanks, Natalia.
Thank you, Natalia, for clarifying some of the things. Corey Zengabad, I work for the BPDA, and typically I ask very direct questions, but I might be a little bit more rambling and give a little bit more of a commentary like Natalia. I think that your questions around philanthropy and funding are very, very insightful, particularly as we get to the implementation phase, because, my agency does a lot of planning and development. And it's a not so, I would say, small secret that oftentimes we look for private philanthropy to make the implementations in the public realm that we would like to see implemented. And, we don't call that philanthropy, we call that mitigation. That's what it's typically referred to. And I think that the challenge here is that, it's a balance between not necessarily wanting to incentivize necessarily the kind of development that would be able to sort of mitigate in this manner. And so, I think that the sort of commentary I want to add is just that, as the city sort of embarks on its community process, which it hasn't really even yet done. I mean, this is really just a conversation, a collection of ideas, if you will. And, I would sort of ask, how might we think also creatively about this question about philanthropy? Because, I think that mitigation is one way, but there is a sort of design opportunity also to consider.
Anyone want to talk about that, how you might attract, they're often referred to as public-private partnerships. Sometimes that means a partnership between a private nonprofit and a public agency, which is becoming increasingly important in the parks world. I would just, in a way, add to Corey's question to say the idea that development mitigation would do this seems sort of unlikely, and not only unlikely, but probably not so great from the standpoint of equity. I mean, to try to generate the amount of development along this corridor that would pay for that would fundamentally change this neighborhood. If that was the way, if you were sort of hostage to that as your funding mechanism, it would lead you down a path that might create other problems. So,
I also want to add one thing, which is that you were talking before about, can you use the mic? I'm sorry.
it's being recorded.
Yes, I'm sorry. Where you were talking about, are there instances where you can point to private development funding transportation projects? And I just wanted to remind folks of Binney Street in Cambridge, where Alexandria Properties, being the sort of major real estate entity along that corridor, is funding that transportation. But again, it's commercial lab space. It's not in a pre-existing residential neighborhood. And so, I think you're hard-pressed to sort of find examples. Sorry, I cut off your stream of thought there.
It's okay. No, I mean, I think you're sort of supporting the same idea that it's not necessarily the way you want to go with Columbia Road. So thoughts about how, where would you start on this if your objective was to attract, we're using the word philanthropy, private nonprofits, whether it's foundations, individuals, people motivated to do this, to, you know, sort of put their private charitable dollars toward an effort that maybe leverages some public dollars to complete it. Have any of you encountered it? It kind of leads me to how are your projects funded? Do you raise money, charitable money, to fund these projects, or how do you do that?
No, every one of our projects is kind of the scenario that Corey is describing. We work with private industry, and the kind of term mitigation is something that we like to try to challenge a little bit. Often with infrastructural or industrial improvement projects, there's a mitigation piece of it. They're often done off-site and away from the kind of source of the impact on a local community, and so you have a disconnection between the people that are impacted and then the operations that are happening and kind of affecting a very local place. So we like to look at the way that those two things can be combined. How can you do mitigation in a way that's completely integrated with the project that is causing an impact? That's what we've worked on with private industry, and then the project in Boston with the DOT is the result of upzoning the area immediately next to the highway. So there is a lot of money that's going into redeveloping, building condominiums right next to I93. And our involvement began with a contribution or a mitigation fee from one of the developers, and that started to kind of open up a conversation about public realm improvements. I think what's a very kind of productive piece in a situation like that is when the developer is involved with, when someone has a stake in a property, they want the infrastructure around it, they want the open spaces around it to be as good as possible. There's another piece of this too with the long-term kind of operation of the viaduct space in I93 is that a couple of local property groups are leasing space for parking under it, which is funding their maintenance and programming of those spaces. And so they have a kind of long-term interest in generating activity there, bringing people through and making it a good project. So I think there are partnerships to be made with local businesses possibly, or with maybe key sites of development potentially to begin to think about how do you kind of think about a project in connection to an infrastructural thing. And of course, planning has to be in place in order to do that. You have to know how you want to deploy the funds and create the connections and everything.
Mark, something to add there?
Yeah, some of our projects have also been involved or funded by sort of mitigation from things that happen someplace else. I think it opens a question, because actually this site also requires mitigation. Some of the people moving through these transportation corridors are from the neighborhood. Many of these people, I suspect, are actually moving through the neighborhood because it's a convenient way around the Southeast Expressway at certain hours, that sort of thing. So the question of like how that mitigation would be like captured is a good one, and maybe that's worth pursuing, to think about like what is the impact, how is that impact happening, who's responsible for causing the problem that needs to be mitigated. That might be worth pursuing, because there's a direct sort of cause and effect, and it's not like the linkage projects where you're developing something downtown and you're spending some money in another part of town that has been tried before. So maybe this is a different way of looking at that.
Toll booths, collect the tolls at either end. So we have a question here on the aisle.
Hi, Chris Moyles. I'm a landscape architect. So Mark, I appreciate some of your comments. And I love these kind of themes, or I guess what I would say dualities almost, connectivity, equality, or continuity and diversity, and would like to kind of dig into those. But I had another comment that I thought was interesting. You mentioned something about how, and we typically find this as well, how different city agencies work within silos within themselves. And also that team building was the most important thing. How do you build the most critical or the most specific team for that project? How do we start this conversation with the city and get the right team together there so that they're moving at the same pace we are?
That's a great question. I have a feeling that maybe this whole series has something to do with that, as a way of inviting people, and actually there are people, as we've seen, from the city here to start to do that. I also have this feeling that maybe it's a generational thing where city budgets are determined, like this is my budget, that's your budget, you're not getting any of my budget. This project that I want to do, as much of your budget as I can get to do that. So I think there's a way that maybe there's institutional changing as generation changes. This has just been my observation when working there for the last 20, 15 years or something like that, that I find really encouraging, and that people actually would be here from different departments in the city and be part of the dialogue, I think is definitely going in the right direction, for sure. That would be my thoughts on that.
Okay, so how about a round of applause for our panel? And thanks to the BSA for hosting this, and really great questions and great audience interaction, which we certainly hoped for. I had some interesting takeaways from this. Particularly this question of whether this is about placemaking or about connectivity, and can it be about both? And who are we doing this for? Can this be done in a way that helps the neighborhoods that it serves and doesn't result in unintended consequences? And how do we start? Where do we start? Some really interesting insights, particularly about individual interventions, short-term interventions that get people used to the idea that there may be a better way to use this space. I was particularly interested in that. So once again, thanks to our panelists for their perspectives and time, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight.